everybody, and welcome back to another lesson in our trades training video series. In this video, we're going to cover what we call the reciprocating saw, its parts, features, and what makes this tool work. As usual, we're going to follow along with a presentation from Teach Construction, and any close-ups or video clips that help explain this tool are going to show up when we need them down here. So let's go ahead and get right into it. The reciprocating saw, this is another free-handed saw. The main thing about this saw is that it reciprocates with the blade. That's the movement of the blade. So we have a blade here, and when this saw is working, it's pushing that blade and pulling that blade back and forth in a straight line. This is what's going to cause this tool to cut through material. We can make cuts in wood, metal, and one of the main things to talk about with this tool is that it is a two-handed saw. Trying to operate this saw with one hand is nearly impossible and very dangerous. So this tool is set up to have two places to put your hands. Here you see a couple different styles of reciprocating saws. The one on the left is cordless. This does not require electricity to it. It uses a battery to power it. The one on the right is going to have a cord on it. The benefit of the one on the left is it's very portable, can be used in a lot of positions and a lot of locations. The electric one, of course, as with any power tool, is going to offer more power and torque, better sawing action, but it's going to be less portable. You're going to have the limitations of the cord to deal with. So going over the parts of the reciprocating saw, we'll start with the pistol grip handle. This is where most of your control of this saw is going to be. You also have a secondary handle here. This is where your support hand is going to go. This tool requires you to hang on to it at all times. It is a very aggressive tool, so it's a two-handed use. There's something to talk about with this saw. A lot of our saws have safety features built in, like blade guards or some kind of a cover or guard. This tool does not. Most of these reciprocating saws have a lot of pinch points and places where blades are exposed. So good trigger habits, keeping your finger off the trigger is very important, and keeping this hand out of this area at all times is really a key feature for making good safe cuts. So the variable speed trigger, I mentioned it earlier. A lot of our tools that need control have this trigger. The function on this is the more that we pull the trigger, the faster the speed of the motor. So I'll demonstrate that. I'll just give it a little tiny pull. I'm just going to move slowly. That's a good way to start a cut, with that slow motion. As I pull it harder or add more pressure to the switch, the speed of the motor gets increasingly faster. So this trigger allows us a lot of control with this tool too. It's important with tools like this we learn to master this variable speed function on that switch. The shoe is a part of this tool. As you can see here on our presentation, it's a pivoting part. It moves, and the reason that it moves is so that in any position that we're cutting, we can make full contact or solid contact with the surface that we're cutting on. This tool does not work very well until we make that solid contact. Now the blade can move back and forth, and we don't get any kind of jarring or major vibration from the cut. Every reciprocating saw has a blade clamp. This is going to be a hand-operated feature that's going to hold the blade in place while you're using the tool. There's a couple different styles. I'm going to start with the one in our presentation. So this particular saw is going to have a blade clamp in that location. We need to unplug the saw before we do any adjustments or blade changes. We have to keep in mind that if we're changing a blade, the blade might be hot from the friction of the cut. In this case, I know this blade is cold, so I'm going to turn this dial, which is going to release the blade clamp. I can then pull the blade out, and now I can insert another blade. I would do that by turning the dial, which opens the clamp, and I'm going to set that blade into that slot. As I release that collar, it's going to lock that blade back in place. Make sure before you use the saw, give the blade a tug to make sure that it has seated and locked in completely. So let's look at the other style that you might see. So this type of blade clamp works a little differently. This one has a lever that's going to unlock the clamp. We're going to pull that all the way up. My blade's now released, and I can pull that blade directly out. I'll take my replacement blade and I'll plug it into that slot. Now I can tighten it up there. Once that's locked down, give it a tug. It's nice and solid. We can continue cutting. Choosing a blade for a reciprocating saw is a very important decision to make based on the job and material that you're trying to cut. So here we have a couple of different choices for blades. And on this presentation, you'll notice there are different styles of blades. Some can be thicker, some cut through metal very easily, some cut through wood very easily, some blades cut through both. And some blades can be thicker and last longer. Some are more expensive, and typically the more expensive blades will last longer and you'll get your money's worth out of them. Blades are going to come in different lengths, and the length of the blade is going to be determined by the length of the material we're trying to cut through. When we go through the process of cutting, we'll get into how to determine the length of the blade best for the job that you're trying to do. The bottom line is that you don't want it too long for the job you're doing or too short. TPI, or teeth per inch, is a concept to talk about with blades. It has to do with the choice and the material you're cutting through. So typically the more teeth per inch, you're going to get a finer cut with more teeth per inch. That's going to be the number of teeth that fall within an inch of length of blade. The less teeth, or the coarser the blade that you have, is going to make that blade cut rougher, but it's also going to cut faster. Sometimes a nice, fine, precise cut is not what you need. You need the speed that a coarse blade or lower TPI can give you. When we're talking about blade length, we have to talk about the long stroke and the short stroke. And this has to do with the action of the reciprocating saw and how it works. So if you think about it, it is pushing that blade forward and it's pulling that blade backward. As it pushes that blade forward, that is going to be the longest extension of that blade, the longest length that it can be. We're going to call that the long stroke. And if you have a blade on there that's too long for the material, it's going to tend to bind a little more. It's going to tend to flap around and wander in that cut. So you don't want a blade that's too long. So consider your long stroke when you're figuring the length of your blade. As well, there's the short stroke. So as that reciprocating saw pulls that blade backwards, there is a minimum depth or length of that reach of that blade. We'll call that the short stroke. It's really important that when you're choosing a blade length, that you choose a blade that will reach through the material on the short stroke, or the shortest reach of that blade. Binding is a constant issue with power tools, but especially with reciprocating saws. So binding is going to be the act of the material pinching on the blade as you're making the cut. Ideally, when we're making a cut, we have a blade that moves freely through the material. That is almost never the case, but you want the least amount of pinching on that blade. So as I have this blade here, if my material it's passing through my material and I'm cutting, I don't feel it. If I get any kind of pinching or binding on the blade, it's going to make my cut a lot harder to make. And with a reciprocating saw, what that amounts to is I'm hanging on with two hands and it can actually start to buck or vibrate while I'm making the cut. Like I said, this tool is going to bind a lot, and as you change directions with the blade, you can cause the binding yourself. A dull blade can bind, pinching of the material. There's a lot of things that can happen to cause this binding. So the bottom line is, if you have binding in a cut, you need to stop that cut, consider what's happening, figure out a way to fix it, change your strategy, change the blade, change the direction or position of the saw, and move forward from there. We need to make some cuts with a reciprocating saw. I don't want to make a mess in my classroom, so let's go into our shop and make some cuts. So here we are in the shop. We're going to make a cut with the reciprocating saw. Let me set this up to say that your materials will almost, I would say 99% of the time, be solid attached to something else. You're always going to be using a reciprocating saw to modify something that's in place. That being said, I've attached this panel to our workstation so it's nice and solid and supported. And as I'm steering the saw, I'm not using this hand, this supporting hand to steer the saw. I'm steering the saw with slight movements or twists of the handle here as I pull the trigger. So let's go ahead and do this. So there is a lot of this idea about body position and angle of your saw while you're making the cut. If you've used a hand saw, this to be straight forward like this doesn't always make your best cut, and it often tends to wander a little too much. Like with a hand saw, if you put a little angle on the blade and the tool, in this case the angle would be not this way, it would always be down this way. I can get a good solid connection of my shoe to my material. That's going to give me support. I also have a better eyesight on the blade and what it's doing, and I'm able to keep it steady and steer it a lot better at this angle. Of course, the lower I get, the harder that gets to be, but this is my ideal angle for making cuts. So here we are with our reciprocating saw again. I want to share you another reason or opportunity where you're going to need this saw, and it works really well. I've installed a block into my training station. This block is going to need to be removed. That's my goal here. I'm going to run it right into the end of each side. I know that I'm not only cutting through wood, I'm also cutting through fasteners. You're going to hear in that cut when the blade makes contact with those fasteners and you have metal on metal. So we're going to go ahead, I'll cut one side and then we'll talk about it, and then I'll cut the other side. So at the point that that block moved, I knew that my fasteners had released from this block. I no longer needed to carry through that cut. Now I have the other side to do. The goal of this is to take out the block and not damage anything else as much as possible. I'm using the edges of these studs to guide the blade through. So let's do the other side and we'll see where we get to. So the block moved, I know it's loose. Now we can pull it or move it out of the way. It's a tight fit. My cuts gave minimal damage to the framing that's being left. My block is out and we can see where my fasteners were cut. Keep in mind also that you're not only cutting through wood, you have to cut through metal. So you need a blade that's going to be good for both. One last thing to talk about with reciprocating saws is the safety aspect of them. It's interesting that I train a lot with reciprocating saws, and one thing that I never have to tell people is to be careful with this saw. The reciprocating saw tends to demand respect from people. You have to hold on to it with two hands. It is going to buck and move on you. So it's not a saw that people get overly comfortable with. One thing that I always have to stress though is this idea of PPE and making sure you have the right safety gear on to protect yourself while you're cutting. That can be safety glasses, hard hats. Some people like to wear gloves when they're using this tool. And the other thing to mention with safety is it is a two-handed saw. Do not think that you can control this saw adequately one-handed. The other thing to talk about is that you have control of the saw. You know what to expect with a cut, or you should know what to expect with a cut. One thing to always keep in mind is predicting what's going to happen when that cut finishes. So with any cut, there's going to be parts or materials that will move or fall away. With a reciprocating saw, this is no exception. So as you get to the end of your cut, you have to start to predict that movement and to be able to work with it and prevent injury and to work your way through that cut for a quality cut. Let's do a review of the reciprocating saw. This is an aggressive tool that requires two hands at all times. No negotiations here. not a tool for finish cuts. This tool, even with your best control, cannot make the quality of cuts that some of our rotating power saws can. Blade choice is really important when using a reciprocating saw. You need to consider the materials you're cutting, the quality of cut that you need, the speed that you need to cut it at, and the length of the blade. All of these things come into play to make a good choice of your blade. Don't blindly cut into anything. This is one that I myself have made this mistake, and especially with this tool. You can cause a lot of damage with this tool if you do not know all of the materials or what's behind what you're cutting. So make sure that you investigate into what is on the other side of what you're cutting. How thick is the material, and what are you getting yourself into when you start this cut and finish this cut out. Watch for binding at the blade. It's inevitable with a reciprocating saw that you're going to bind it. Could be a number of factors. The way you might be causing the binding, the blade might be dull. It could be your position. It could be a change in the bearing of the materials. So if you end up with binding with this saw, stop your cut. You can stop at any point and continue. You might have to change your strategy a little bit, change a blade, and then continue to get through that cut. This is a list of terms used when we're talking about the reciprocating saw. And as always, I like to talk about this idea of learning the language of building and using it on the job site. Knowledge is power, and it can only help us to build better. I hope you've learned something about this tool we call the reciprocating saw. It's one of those saws that you're not going to use all day every day, but when you need it, it's the only tool that can get the job done. So thanks for watching. Let's get back to work. This video is a production of Trade Skills U, all rights reserved. If you provide instruction in the construction trades and have a need for videos like these, please contact us at tradeskillsu.com. The presentation and the images used in this lesson video were provided by the Teach Construction Initiative. If you're a teacher or instructor and would like access to these and similar resources, please visit us at teachconstruction.org for more information.